Well, one of the things that we've observed is that while most pastors recognize uh, needs, they don't necessarily have a sense of exactly what do I do. Uh, you know, since most of the American church is so heavily influenced by, let's just call it the post World War II growth of the church programmatically, we tend to think of ministry as the idea of producing programming similar to what we grew up with or what we've known for decades. Well, programming from the 20th century is not effective in reaching people in the 21st century. So we think of what we do as more of a process than a program. Reboot Now is such a process. What it does is it simplifies the core of what needs to happen for a church to gain vitality or to revitalize. Now, those words are somewhat interchangeable, but the way I think about it has to do with the life cycle of a church. Uh, when a church is still growing and healthy, I think of this as vitalization. Whereas once a church tips to the backside of the life cycle, now we're talking about revitalization. But semantics aside, the process is the same, just applied to different degrees, depending on the degree of health of the church. So Reboot Now is a process of aligning ministry with the Great Commission. Uh, I've never met a pastor who didn't think that the Great Commission was important, but I have met many pastors who don't have a sense of how to apply the Great Commission as a central core of ministry. The Great Commission is more of an aspiration than a guideline. Uh, and so what we've done is we have created a process that helps pastors and leaders align their ministries with going and making disciples, going in the authority of Christ to make disciples, to baptize, to teach obedience to the commands of Christ, fully aware that Christ is with them to the end of the age through the power of the Holy Spirit. So the Great Commission is much bigger than just go and make disciples. It's a Trinitarian connection of multi-level ministry that encompasses outreach and evangelism and discipleship and worship. And so Reboot Now is just a 5-track process in making that happen. In training, we lay that process out. And give pastors and leaders, let's just call it the railroad tracks that they can follow to move from where they are to where they want to be by the grace of God.
It also answers the question that many churches and pastors have now coming out of COVID. What's next?
Yeah, that's great.
And I have spoken to a lot of pastors, particularly in small to medium-sized churches, that have been deeply impacted with the mask and with the vaccine and with the elections and with everything else. Now that they've kind of gotten through that crisis mode and stabilized, they're thinking, oh my gosh, now what do we do? And I think that there's a prime time here, a window for churches to be able to pivot and align themselves to the Great Commission and sunset many of the things that they have been doing previously, because there's been 2.5 years that have passed since they were doing those things. 2-3 years ago, it may be more difficult to uh, aspire to align your church to the Great Commission. But since the COVID and everything that's happened, it seems to me that churches and pastors are hungry in asking what's next and reimagining and revisioning what's possible in their church and the way that the church impacts their community.
That's awesome. So I've got two questions for you guys. One, David, you just said you've talked to a lot of people at small and medium-sized churches, which makes me ask, Is Reboot now designed for a particular size of church, or is it is it scalable across the board? Will it work the same in a church of 5,000 members as it would in a church of 50 members?
Yes, the process is the same, the structure is the same. It is totally scalable. However, the larger numbers you have and the more staff people you have and the more elders you have, the more complex it gets. And it may require more time. It also may require quite a bit more negotiation within the staff and the elders to get everybody on the same page. Because when we begin to work with churches, there's some deep philosophical things that they have to wrestle with,
Yeah.
and a lot of people don't like to wrestle with those questions, but it's central to the core of how are you going to align your church to the Great Commission in your community at this time? And as you can tell just by that question, we could spend 40 hours in a church staff
and I think
setting
you will
debating.
with people.
Yeah,
For sure.
debating. So yeah.
Okay,
So,
so that's good, which leads me to my second question is, when you are implementing this process with a church, is it primarily with like just the lead pastor, or is it with like the entire leadership team? Does it do you start out by presenting it to the entire church as a whole? Obviously, that's probably going to be different depending on the size of the church and its structure, and even the denominational affiliation of the church and all that kind of stuff. But is there a system that you guys have seen work pretty well for how you begin that process?
Yeah, there is definitely a system. Granted, this is sort of the irony or the paradox is that each church is unique, and yet there is a wealth of common denominators. um, uh, I will say this: ultimately, the all of the leadership needs to be on board. Ultimately, the larger percentage of the congregation that's on board, the better. However, you have to start someplace, and you cannot start on such a broad scale. So the language that we use is that we ask the church to put together what we call a vision team. There's typically about 4 or 5, 6 people. Rule of thumb, I say pastor plus 5. The reason that I say pastor is because if you're really going to make a cultural shift in your church's ministry, if the senior leader is not engaged, it's not going to happen. Right. What that communicates to the congregation is that this is not important enough for our lead pastor to be intimately involved. Well, you've already hurt yourself before you start. So the idea is to have a highly respected vision team at the wheel. And so our work is primarily with that vision team. Now, we do broad training with an entire congregation. We do multiple Zoom conferences with any number of folks. But the vision team is the primary body of people on site that are getting it done. One thing I'd be quick to add is that one of the first things we do with the vision team is surround them with prayer teams. Each vision team member is to recruit a personal prayer team in order to support the work of the vision team. Because what we've learned is that there are 2 sides to bringing vitality. One side is what we call spiritual renewal. The other side is strategic initiative. You have to have both of those working in tandem for a church to make the kind of pivot that David mentioned a moment ago. So obviously the prayer teams fall heavily on the spiritual renewal side, but we're using the prayer teams strategically to support the work of the vision team. So that's an example of how the spiritual and the strategic intertwine as they work through this process.
One, that's amazing, everything we've been talking about. The second thing that you mentioned that struck me is the post-World War II boomer generation. Tell us a little bit about your boomer mobilization initiative.